like many other people, I'd read, Russian literature in translation. I'd read War and Peace, and, I'd loved the book, actually. I mean, particularly the story parts of it. I wasn't one really at that time when I was a teenager. I thought Tolstoy went on a bit, in terms of his theories of the great man and of history and, kind of social change, though now I appreciate it more. But when I was about 14, I was like, this man needed an editor.
Yeah.
Could he have just got on with the story? What an amazing story. What an incredible, kind of book this is.
I still think he needs an editor, but no.
Yeah. Well, I think his wife tried, didn't she? But he got quite upset with her. And then I kind of thought to myself, well, how do I study Russian? Because there were very few schools in my region, given the impoverishment of the region, where you could study Russian. So I would have to take Russian from scratch. And this is where things get really quite interesting, because there were opportunities to study Russian at universities, but I would need to have, first of all, an intensive Russian language course in the summer. And I didn't have the money for that. And the period is around the miners' strike in the United Kingdom in 1984. Now, the miners of County Durham had, very interestingly, had exchanges and ties with the miners of Donbas going back to the 1920s.
Right.
And as I studied Russian history, I discovered there was lots of contacts between, Bolshevik, Soviet Union, the early period after the Russian Revolution, but even before that, during the imperial period in Russia, between the northern England and the Russian Empire in the old industrial areas. Basically, big industrial areas like the northeast of England and places like Donbas were built up at the same time, often by the same sets of industrialists. And Donetsk in the Donbas region used to be called Husivka, because it was established by a Welsh industrialist who brought in miners from Wales to help, kind of develop the coal mines there, and also the steelworks and others that, we're hearing about all the time. And so I got very fascinated in all these linkages, and, famous writers from the early parts of the Soviet Union, like Yevgeny Zamyatin, worked in the shipyards in Newcastle upon Tyne. And there was just this whole set of connections. And in 1984, when the miners' strike took place, the miners of Donbas, along with other miners from famous coal regions like the Ruhr Valley, for example, in Germany, or miners in Poland, sent money in solidarity to the miners of County Durham. And there'd been these exchanges, as I said, going back and forth since the 1920s, formal exchanges between miners, the region, the miners' unions. And I heard, again, from the same great uncle who told me to study Russian, that there were actually scholarships for the children of miners, and it could be former miners as well, for their education. And I should go along to the Miners' Hall, a place called Red Hills, where the miners of County Durham had actually pooled all of their resources and built up their own parliament and their own, kind of place that they could talk among themselves to figure out how to enhance the welfare and well-being of their communities. And they'd put money aside for education for miners. There was all kinds of lecture series from the miners and all kinds of other activities supporting soccer teams and artistic circles and writing circles, for example. People like George Orwell, were involved in some of these writers' circles in other parts of Britain in mining communities, for example. And so they told me I could, go along and basically apply for a grant to go to study Russian. So I show up. And it was the easiest, application I've ever come across. They just asked me to, my dad came along with me. They asked me to verify, that my dad had been a miner, and they looked up his employment record on little cards, kind of a little tray somewhere. And then they asked me how much I needed, to basically pay for the travel and some of the basic expenses for the study. And they wrote me a check. And so thanks to the miners of Donbas, and this money that was deposited with the miners of County Durham, with the Durham Miners Association, I got the money to study Russian for the first time before I embarked on my studies at university.
As you're speaking now, it's reminding me that there's a different way to look both at history and at geography and at different places. Is, this is an industrial region.
That's right.
And it echoes in the experience of living there is more captured not by Moscow or Kiev, but by, at least historically, but by just being a mining town, an industrial
That's right,
town.
in the
So,
place itself.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are places in the United States, in Appalachia, in West Virginia, and in Pennsylvania, like the Lehigh Valley, that have the same sense of place. And the northeast of England, was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. It was the industrial version of of Silicon Valley, which has its own, I would say, contours and frames. And when you come to those industrial areas, your previous identities get submerged in that larger framework. I've always looked at the world through that lens of being, someone from the working class, the blue collar communities, from a very specific place with lots of historical and economic connotations. And it's also a melting pot, which is the problems that the Donbas has experienced over the last 30 years, that people came from all over the place to work there. Of course, there was a population that one might say is indigenous, might have gone back centuries there, but they would have been, in the smaller rural farming communities, just like it was the same in the northeast of England. And people, in the case of the northeast of England, came from Wales, they came from further in the south of England, the Midlands, they came from Scotland, they came from Ireland. I have all of that heritage in my own personal background, and you've got a different identity. And it's when somebody else tries to impose an identity on you from the outside that things go awry. And I think that that's kind of what we've really seen in the case of Donbas. It's a place that's apart in many respects, historically, and in terms of its evolution and development over time. And, particularly in the case of, Russia, the Russians have tried to say, well, look, because most people speak Russia there as the lingua franca. I mean, in the northeast of England, of course, everyone spoke English, but lots of people were Irish speakers, Gaelic Irish speakers, or, some of them might have certainly been Welsh speakers. There was lots of Welsh miners who spoke Welsh as their first language who came there, but they created an identity. It's the same in Belfast, in Ulster, the northern province of the whole of the Irish island. The part of Ireland that is still part of the United Kingdom. That was also a heavily industrialized area, high manufacturing, mass manufacturing, shipbuilding, for example. People came from all over there too, which is why when Ireland got its independence from the United Kingdom, Ulster, Belfast, and that whole region, kind of clung on, because it was, again, that melting pot. It was kind of intertwined with the larger industrial economy and had a very different identity. And so that, for me, growing up in such a specific place with such a special, in many respects, heritage, gave me a different perspective on things. When I first went to the Soviet Union in 1987 to study there, I actually went to a translators institute, what was then called the Maurice Thérèse, which is now the Institute of Foreign Languages. Mm-hmm. I was immediately struck by how similar everything was to the north of England, because it was just like one big working class culture that had sort of broken out onto the national stage. Everything in Northern England was nationalised. We had British steel, British coal, British rail, British shipbuilding, because after World War II, the private sector had been devastated and the state had to step in. And of course, the Soviet Union is one great big giant nationalised economy when I get there. And it's just the people's attitudes and outlooks are the same. People didn't work for themselves. They always worked for somebody else. And it had quite a distortion on the way that people looked at the world.
Do you still speak Russian?
I do, yeah.
Вы по-русски говорите?
Yeah, можно, конечно, если хотите.
Ну да, тогда мне надо что-нибудь сказать, и все будут думать, о чем мы сейчас говорим.
Yeah, it would be a big mystery for everybody. And you have an advantage on me because it's your native language as well.
For people wondering, the English speakers in the audience, you're really missing a lot from the few sentences we said there. Yeah, it's a fascinating language that stretches actually geographically across a very large part of this world.